Hi, welcome to Tales of Dread. With Armistice Day, Remembrance Day or Poppy Day coming up, we celebrate the end of World War II, but in this video we'll have a look at the mysteries of the Second World War. With the tide of war shifting, what were the Nazi ideas that could still shift the war in their favor? Let's have a look at the Nazi Antarctic base, their UFOs like the Horn-Ebu or the Glocke, and their plan to nuke New York. Before we dive in, please leave this video a like and share, and don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell icon. Now it's time for some stories. After World War II was over, the winning countries sent many military expeditions to the Antarctic region. Did these battleships drop anchor in the name of science and exploration? Or did they set sail to find something much worse? A bad thing that lived in the ice. No matter how many times Captain Halcyon and his crew searched the waters around the Antarctic Peninsula during the holiday season, they never really got used to the fact that it was always daytime, but the fact that it was always light made it much easier to find the whale pods they were desperately trying to catch. But it also made the ship's crew look like shambling zombies who hadn't slept in days. This might have explained why the lookout on the Juliana had taken so long to notice the ship that was now just off their starboard beam that morning. Polka was down in his cabin, looking dejectedly at his charts, hoping that it would give him an idea to change the course of what had been a wasted trip so far, all the way from their home in Iceland. Then he heard shouting from above the whalers. The ship's famous red and black naval ensign was not flying, so the captain and the rest of his crew stood on the deck and looked helplessly across the water at the deck gun that was now pointed at their ship. The Creed's marine U-boat was easy to spot because of its smooth lines. There were rumors that some German submarines didn't hear or follow the last orders to surrender. But the war had been over for more than 2 years. What had they found? People in grey and green overalls were running across the deck of the submarine, and a short time later, people in inflatable boats made their way towards the Juliana. They had no weapons to defend themselves, and there were no other ships nearby. Polka told his men to line up and not fight their captors so he could listen to their transmissions. As the Germans were pulling themselves up over the railings, someone broke away from the group and walked over to where he was standing. The captain of the U-boat apologized cheerfully for the trouble and asked if he and his crew could buy half of the remaining supplies on the whaling ship. Even though he was friendly and polite, the tone of the submariner's request made him think it would be a bad idea for him to say no. He didn't like the fact that each German sailor had a pistol or a carbine, but he reluctantly agreed to the idea. He was given a big roll of US dollars right away, and he was told that there should be enough money left over to give each member of his crew a small bonus for their hard work. As time went on, the captain of the submarine left. He had stopped and asked Alka to bring up one of his charts from his cabin. He then pointed to a spot not too far away and said that there was a big group of humpback whales there. He then saluted, and went back over the ship's side. The Icelandic crew couldn't figure out what was going on as the submarine turned away and slowly moved away, never to be seen again. On December 2, 1946, a small group of U.S. from the naval base in Norfolk, Virginia, ships set sail. Operation High Jump was the name of the mission, which included 13 ships, such as the aircraft carrier USS Philippine Sea and the destroyers USS Henderson and USS Brownson. They were told to go deep into the barren Antarctic Circle to do military drills and scientific experiments. Rear Admiral Richard E. Lee was in charge of the operation. Byrd Jr. was an experienced polar explorer who had been to the Antarctic many times before on both civilian and military trips. When the task force finally got to its destination, it started taking a lot of photos of the area right away. However, only a few weeks later, it was called back because of reports of dangerous weather. Soon after the ships that took part in the operation went back to their home ports, rumors about what had really happened started to spread. Newspapers in Chile said that the US fleet had been attacked by unidentified flying craft that had caused heavy casualties and forced the Americans to leave. This only added to the rumors when Admiral Byrd made a number of significant comments about the mission during a TV interview. He talked about how planes could come from the South Pole and attack the United States. He also said that he and his countrymen could no longer use their distance from other hostile countries as a good way to protect themselves. Almost right away, Operation Windmill, a follow-up mission to the remote area, was given the green light. It ended in April 1948. After this, the US seemed to lose interest in the area until they decided, more than a decade later, to set off 3 nuclear bombs there. The reason for doing this was to see what would happen if nuclear bombs were set off in the upper atmosphere of the Earth. It's possible that America has forgotten about its short-lived interest in the southern polar region. If a Soviet-era intelligence report hadn't come out in 1991, it would have given a very different explanation for why Operation High Jump was cut short. The report was supposedly made up of transcripts of interviews between KGB agents and a few US sailors who were part of the expedition. The leaked report said that an unknown enemy power had attacked the American fleet in Antarctica and forced them to leave. The report says that around the middle of February 1947, American ships were sailing through the Weddell Sea when the USS Brownson noticed that unknown planes were following her. At first, these were described as fast-moving lights off in the distance, but as they got closer and closer, radar screens on the Brownstone began to pick up on them as well. As the US ships were getting closer to each other, 5 of the planes started to fly low over the fleet, weaving in and out of the tightly packed American ships as fast as they could. When hostile Captain Jim Bauer saw what they were doing, he told the gunners on the Brownstone to shoot at the attackers. The 40mm anti-aircraft cannons on the destroyer started firing right away. The witnesses said that the 5 unidentified planes were shaped like saucers. They also said that when the Browns and Greys opened fire, the strange planes fired back with incredible beams of light and heat while fighter planes were scrambling to take off from the deck of the USS Casablanca. The advanced enemy weapons had burned them out of the sky, leaving their planes and crews as little more than ash. The Americans' return fire wasn't very effective because the attackers were faster and better at turning, but as the battle went on, there was a small victory when one of the mysterious ships flew over the USS Senate. The flying machine was hit by a lucky shot from the submarine's deck gun. The 5-inch shell sent the flying machine spinning wildly to one side. When the crashed plane hit the water, it exploded with a lot of force. Then, though, there was a bigger explosion. The constant attack on the destroyer USS Maddox, which was part of the task force, caused a lot of damage, including a fire that spread to her magazines and killed everyone on board. All of the people on board were killed by the explosion, and the ship sank to the bottom of the sea when its crew realized they were no match for the enemy. The Americans would spend the next few days trying to get out of the area while the unknown attackers kept bothering them. At the end of the report, the author made a guess that the next US mission to the area had also failed to beat the forces that were against them, and that the US had finally used nuclear weapons in a last-ditch effort to beat their mysterious opponent. Commentators and people who believe in conspiracies all over the world used the Soviet document as proof that something bad was hiding in the safety of the South Pole. Some people thought it was the final proof that aliens lived and moved among us. This was the last stronghold of Nazi resistance to survive the Second World War. Some people thought that Hitler's fugitive forces used alien technology they had found to build a glorious Fourth Reich under the ice caps. Even a quick look shows that the Soviet report has glaring mistakes that hurt its credibility. But maybe this isn't so surprising since most of the work done by Russian intelligence staff during the communist era was based on what the author's masters wanted to hear rather than a more accurate account of what happened. For example, the USS Casablanca, an aircraft carrier, is mentioned over and over again. It did not sail with the high jump flotilla, instead, it stayed in Norfolk, waiting to be taken out of service during the expedition. It's possible that the witnesses got the Casablanca and the USS Currituck mixed up over time, but there's also the problem of the USS Maddox, which is said to have sunk. Again, the Maddox had nothing to do with the mission in the Antarctic. During the Second World War, the US Navy built 2 destroyers with this name. The first was sunk by German dive bombers during the invasion of Italy in 1940. Her namesake also served in the war, and she went on to fight in the Vietnam War, where she was involved in the infamous Gulf of Tonkin incident. However, neither of them would have been in the Antarctic during the winter of 1947. Lastly, the official high jump diaries strongly disagree with the claims that the attackers destroyed American fighter planes and caused a large number of deaths. During the expedition's time in the Antarctic, 4 people are said to have died. 3 people died when their PBM Mariner crashed because of bad weather. In another accident, a sailor was killed while putting scientific equipment on the ice. If we're going to believe the Soviet story, there are 2 possible reasons why these facts are wrong. The first is that the report was an attempt by the US to spread false information in order to find traitors in their own ranks and confuse their enemy. The second is that the event really did happen, and that the US government used the Cold War's fear and paranoia to cover up and hide all evidence of it, citing national security as their reason. So, it might be easy to dismiss the Russian account as a work of fiction, but it is clear that something out of the ordinary did happen that caused the high jump expedition to end earlier than planned. Also worth thinking about are the cryptic things Rear Admiral Byrd said about how suddenly America had a lot more to worry about from possible attackers coming from that area. It's easy to laugh off the crazy conspiracy theories that say a huge Nazi stronghold is hidden in the huge geothermal vents found under the ice. But the fact is that one of Hitler's many goals was to set up a presence for the Third Reich in all the far-flung parts of the world. He spent a lot of time and effort on this goal. In 1938, a German cargo ship called M.S. Schwab inland left its home port of Hamburg and headed toward the South Pole through the South Atlantic. The ship was carrying 2 Dornier seaplanes that could land on the ice because they were equipped with skis. Alfred Richer, who was a well-known German explorer, was in charge of the mission. The German group finally reached land in a place called the Princess Martha Coast, which the Norwegian government had already claimed. They changed the name to New Schwab Inland right away and set up a permanent research station for their scientists to work from. From there, they flew many missions to check out the area around their camp. After 6 months, Richard and his crew would go back to Hamburg and start making plans for another trip back to the area. Official records show, though, that this second expedition never happened because the start of World War II made it impossible to gather the people and supplies they would have needed. But it is clear that the German government did make more trips into the polar regions without any paperwork. On the island of Alexandra Land near the North Pole, the remains of a long-abandoned naval outpost were only found in 2014. Its rusting bunkers and Nazi flags were damning proof that we still know very little about Adolf Hitler and his secret plans. Most people think that Captain Halkias's story about meeting a mysterious German submarine in 1947 is made up, but it's not impossible. In the past, about 100 to 50 large ships have disappeared without a trace from the world's oceans, and some of them are still missing today. There were a lot of German U-boats. During the Second World War, 1,000 of these submarines went out to sea, and more than 20 are still missing. No one knows what happened to them or where they died. There is also a lot of evidence that Luftwaffe engineers did make aircraft using technology that was new at the time. Some of these prototypes did look like what has become known as the classic shape of a flying saucer. The most famous of these was the Horn Abu, which was only able to do a few test flights before the bases it was using were taken over by the occupying forces. There is little doubt that, if given enough time, the Germans could have turned the tide of battle in the last days of the war, and they wouldn't have needed alien technology to do it. After all, German science, technology, and engineering helped break the sound barrier and make the first long-range ballistic missiles that worked and the first stealth aircraft. The Horn Abu wasn't powered by technology from Mars. Instead, it was said to be one big turbine engine inside a circular airframe. It was said to have speed and maneuverability that were unmatched for its time, and it is scary to think about how much damage it could have done to the Allied powers if it had been tested for even a few more months. Once the more fantastic and outlandish parts of the Operation High Jump saga are taken out, what could be easily written off as a creative piece of science fiction seems to have a lot of substance that worries me. Uncomfortably, it is clear that when the US military went to the South Pole after World War II, they ran into something they didn't expect. They had to fight it over and over again, and they might have even had to use nuclear weapons to beat it. It may never be known for sure if this mysterious force was from another planet or if it came from the worst crimes in human history. We'll have to wait and see what other proof is still out there. As people continue to explore the Antarctic, who knows what abandoned towns and sunken ships are waiting to be found, perfectly preserved under the polar ice. The German war machine's attempts to turn the tide of war in their favor have led to many stories about advanced and dangerous weapons. Among the rumors of alien technology and experiments with the paranormal, one story stands out, that of a mysterious machine whose ultimate purpose is still a mystery. What was Die Glocke? The testing center was near the border with Czechoslovakia. The people who lived there called it Der Riese, which means the giant. The soldiers there didn't know much about what the scientists they were in charge of were doing. Aside from that, it was said to have the power to change the course of a war. The soldiers were well equipped and fed to a much higher standard than the rest of the fair market, but few of them had been in active service. Most of them had spent their whole short time in the military protecting secret projects like this one. The sound of the artillery fire, which was getting closer and closer, gave them a lot of reason to worry. Safe behind overlapping barbed wire fences and machine gun nests made of concrete and steel, the scientists did what they had to do in a planned and methodical way. Their main worry was not about the Russians who were coming. Using the highly volatile materials they were working with, the risk of making a mistake was a much bigger threat than an advancing army. The main hangar's doors were opened, and a new group of people were rushed inside. People in charge called them volunteers, but the only reason they were here was because if they hadn't, they would have had to jump from a short rope at the end of a long drop. Few things in life can drive a person more than the thought of being put to death. Once everyone was inside, the guards left and locked the doors behind them. Up on the viewing platform, scientists and military officers watched without emotion as the small group of men slowly made their way through the room and towards the strange-looking object in the middle. A technician flipped a switch, which turned on a nearby power source, and after a few moments, a faint thrum could be heard. As the sound got louder and stronger, the men standing close to it looked nervously at each other. From where they were standing, they could see that the air around the object was starting to shimmer and blur. One of the volunteers suddenly fell to the floor, his legs giving out from under him. He didn't make a sound as he fell, but when he hit the ground, the others screamed in fear and surprise. Some people started to move away from the thing, while others ran back to the doors as fast as they could. The constant shaking kept getting worse, and more of the scared men started to trip and fall. After a few minutes, the last test subject was lying still on the ground, and the whole thing was over. The signal to turn off the power was given, and the loud hum started to fade as the soldiers went back into the hangar and started picking up the melted bodies that were now lying around. Several people in white lab coats went straight towards the thing. Inside the glass cylinder, a dark red liquid was taken out and whisked away for further study. Even though they got the results of the experiment, they were not all the same. They were after, and it was clear that the efforts to improve the object's outside shielding had not been enough, but that didn't matter. More people would sign up to help, more things would be made, and the Reich would win. Reports from Poland were the first to talk about the mysterious device called Die Glocke, or the bell. In 2000, a reporter named Igor Witkowski wrote a book about his research into the secret experiment. The author said that he was able to get his hands on secret records from his country's military intelligence services. Some of these records were about how an SS group and Führer named Jakob Spoor-Enberg were questioned after the war. Witkowski's book, The Truth About the Wonder Weapon, was popular for a short time, but it didn't reach a wide audience. It was, however, read by a number of people outside its country of origin, one of whom was the British writer and neurologist Nick Cook. Witkowski's material was scarce and lacking in corroboration, but it intrigued Cook to the extent that he too began to investigate the reports, determined to bring the story to an international audience buried within the depositions, allegedly written by Spartanburg. Before he showed up at Poland's war crime tribunals, he gave a long description of a piece of scientific equipment that the German government had gone to great lengths to hide from their enemies. This machine was thought to have been used to make an unknown type of fuel, but it was so dangerous to use that many scientists who worked on it died. The machine was nicknamed the bow because of its physical appearance. A book described it as being approximately 4 m high and 2.5 meters wide, made entirely of metal with a hemispherical domed top. Huge amounts of power were needed in order to operate it, which in turn created a blue and violet haze around its hull. During the early stages of its creation, the SS's Lieutenant General said that an invisible field was created around the machine. When plants and foliage samples were put in this zone, it reached out to about 200 meters. During the machine's operation, they would slowly break down into a greasy organic fluid, but the most horrifying thing was what it did to people and animals in the area. The unknown forces coming out of the device form crystals in the tissues of any living thing that comes in contact with them. The victim's blood would clot and harden into a thick gel-like substance, killing them almost instantly and making it very painful. Once the machine was turned off, the blood would naturally turn back into a liquid, pour out of the bodies, and pool on the floor around them. This process would allegedly kill 5 out of 7 of the original scientists assigned to the project until an effective means was found which could shield them from its effects. Spoor-Enberg says that he doesn't know exactly what this force was, but that it was strong enough to lift the device off the ground for short periods of time, letting it hover a few feet above the ground. Inside its metal case were 2 cylinders that were made to spin around each other very quickly in a counterclockwise direction. When the power was switched on, unknown substances were added to these cylinders, which in turn went on to achieve the experiment's ultimate goal: the creation of an unknown crimson-colored fluid. Many people have thought that the chemical Die Glocke made was red mercury, which is thought to make fish grow faster and increase the power of nuclear weapons. Other commentators, who were quick to point out that red mercury has never been made or studied in a way that could be proven, thought that the machine was a simple particle accelerator. It's possible that the Germans were able to get samples of thorium, which the process turned into something else called protecting material. This material would naturally start to break down as soon as it was made, so after about a month it would turn into what was basically weapons-grade uranium. There is a lot of evidence that the Reich tried to get the materials it needed to make atomic weapons, so this theory about what the bells were really for makes sense. Another possibility is that the Germans were trying to solve another urgent problem that was making it hard for them to keep fighting. Even at the start of World War II, Germany didn't have enough of the basic resources it needed to power its military might. This shows how important it is to find a source of sustainable and renewable energy. As the war went on, her scientists were constantly trying to combine their existing fuel sources into new compounds and uses, but none of them worked well enough to be used widely. Other ideas about how the blocker worked turned out to be much stranger and scarier. Some people think that the harmful field it made may have been done on purpose, and that the Germans want to make a lot of these devices and then use them on the front lines. This action would have caused a lot of people to die, which would have been terrible for their enemies' armies and also given the Reich a huge psychological edge. Many people think that the device was some kind of anti-gravity technology meant to power a new generation of fighter planes like the Horn Abu. However, the testimony of a scientist named Otto Cheney shows that the device could be used in a way that is by far the most terrifying. Cheney was one of a number of German academics who were brought back to the United States after the war as part of Project Paperclip. They were used in the American rocket program, and Cheney is said to have said that a concave mirror on the ball could show the operators images from the past and future. This makes it scary to think that the Germans might have found a way to move through time, and that Die Glocke might have been a prototype for a real-time machine. Who knows what the world would be like today if the Reich had been able to change the past, as silly as that sounds. There is no scientific or photographic proof that Die Glocke ever existed. Skeptics think that the stories were just made up by a disgraced war criminal who was trying to make his captors like him. But when some parts of the device's story are looked at more closely, it's shocking to see how they match up with what we know about the last days of World War II. In Poland, near the town of Ludwig, you can still see the remains of the testing center that Hamburg talked about in her testimony. Deep tunnels were blasted into the insides of the nearby Vince's Wash mine so that Allied planes couldn't see what the German scientists were doing. But the most interesting thing about the site is that it has two concrete buildings that are falling apart. Both are made up of a circle of concentric concrete posts that are set up in the same way as the stone circles at Stonehenge in England. Because of this, people call them the henches. Some people think Die Glocke may have been tied to testing rigs and put to use. Jacob Orembig spent most of the war in charge of SS police units in the Lublin district of Poland, but in 1940, he and most of his staff were sent to Norway. Rudolf Schuster, another German officer, later confirmed what Spartanburg said. Schuster was also stationed in Lublin during the war, but he was captured by American forces while being questioned in Berlin after the war. This happened completely separately from Spartanburg. He also told his captors what the blocker was. Schuster said that his Russian troops were getting close to the testing site. He was in charge of moving the device and the technicians who were working on it to a place nobody knew. One of the most interesting parts of the Glocke story is that the top officer on the project was supposedly a SS general named Hans. Kamera wanted to be successful and was disgustingly loyal to the Nazis. During the last few months of the war, he was able to take control of Hitler's wonder weapon programs. In March 1945, Kamera told his men to shoot at a group of refugees who were blocking his way through the Arnsberg forest. As a result, 200 men, women, and children were killed. And Kamera would become one of the most wanted people by people who look into war crimes. As his pursuers got closer, it seems he killed himself, and the law said he was dead. Campbell's body was never found 3 years after the war ended, and there were rumors that he had made it to South America or been picked up by the USS. Agents to help with Project Paperclip kept showing up. However, like most other military forces at the time, his command had been split up and sent to different units as the German armies retreated, so it is impossible to know what really happened to him and the soldiers he was in charge of. Records from after the war show that General Kammler and about 600 of his staff made their way from Poland to Austria in April 1945. They took lorries full of equipment with them. By the time American infantry units got to the area, there was no sign of him or whatever he was with. Because of the stories and legends about the hunters, reports that link Hans cameras to Austria are especially interesting. Big part of the country. For hundreds of years, people have said that groups of people have vanished or gone back in time in the hunters' big mountains. In 2011, a writer named Stan Wolf wrote a book that made a shocking claim. Wolf said that shepherds in the area said they saw a group of Nazi soldiers walk right into a rock wall and disappear, never to be seen again. Another witness said that he saw young German soldiers living in a network of caves in the mountains. They were aging at an oddly slow rate and didn't seem to know that the war they were fighting was over. Is it possible that Kammler and his scientists had figured out how to use Die Glocke well enough to get away from the Allies by going forward or backward in time? This claim would sound crazy if it weren't for what would happen in the Pennsylvanian town of Kex. 20 years after the war ended, on December 9, 1965, in the afternoon, radar operators watched an object fall from the sky over Kecksburg. The crash site of this object was quickly locked down and the object was found before the press could get there, according to the few people who were there when the object was found. It looks so much like Jacob's spore that it's hard to believe. Hamburg says that Die Glocke is a metal ship that looks like a bell and has strange ruins and hieroglyphs all over it. People think that Die Glocke moved forward in time from 1945, appeared in space above the Earth, and then crashed and landed in North America. Another possibility is that the Allied forces were able to get both hands back. Kammler and his technology came from Nazi Germany, and the Kecksburg crash happened because the US tried out the bell. We are very unlikely to ever know for sure if Die Glocke was real or just a story that has grown on its own. All we can do is keep following a frustrating and disjointed trail of evidence that stubbornly points to the possibility that the story may have some truth to it. Looking at German weapons experiments from the time period as a whole and ignoring stories that say they involved alien technology or satanic rituals. It is not impossible that German scientists made a weapon system that was very advanced for its time. But until we have solid proof, all we can do is wonder. From solar cannons to armies that can travel back in time. Hitler's wonder weapons program has influenced almost all areas of science fiction in some way. Most of the time, these crazy ideas never got much further than the drawing board. But there is worrying evidence that the Third Reich may have come close to using nuclear weapons on American soil. As the sun went down behind the horizon, the single bomber with 2 engines moved steadily along the Baltic coast. The plane's pilot, Hans Zinser, knew that the Luftwaffe could only fly safely at dusk. Too early for the enemy's night fighters and too late for their daytime patrols. The high-ankle 111 that he flew was quickly becoming a rare sight. At the start of the war, this model was one of the most common bombers, but because High Command wanted to use their resources to make new, untested planes, the heavy losses their existing bomber fleet had taken were not being fixed. Since I had avoided active duty, and instead worked as a test pilot, I was not affected by this. The bomber he was moving from one side of Germany to the other was going to be changed, which would greatly increase its range of operations. This was a bad thing to have to do, but it was necessary because the enemy was slowly taking back the airfield, which had been taken by the Wehrmacht as it swept across Europe in the early months of the war. As he flew, the light outside the cockpit got dimmer and dimmer, making Zinser feel more and more uneasy. He took one last look around, looking for enemy fighters and landmarks that he could use to figure out where he was. Then he looked down at the map that was resting on his right leg. He thought, based on the dim light above him, that he was now southwest of Lübeck and moving into the province of Mecklenburg. He was still looking at the map when all of a sudden, the cabin was filled with blinding white light. When the light went away, he was shocked to see a huge cloud rising up off to the starboard side. He watched the hypnotist for about a minute as it grew into a big mushroom shape. When all of a sudden, a big shock wave hit him. He was violently pulled away from the control column, and the plane veered to one side as if it had been hit by a huge open palm. It was about to go into a dive that couldn't be stopped, but the pilot was able to get it back under control. This wasn't the first time he had to fight to keep a plane in the air. But when he finally got the high ankle level, he was shocked by what he could see through the windows of the cockpit. About 10 miles away from where he was standing, the sky was now filled with the huge mushroom-shaped cloud. Since you thought that the bomber had been hit by the pressure wave caused by this huge explosion, he turned his plane towards the cloud to try to figure out what had caused such a huge explosion. As he got closer, the bomber's electrical system started to go wrong and his radio seemed to stop working altogether. He frowned as he turned away and noticed that the cloud had a color that was almost violet blue and looked like it was lit up from the inside by small explosions. He wrote down that the cloud was about 1 kilometer wide and that the edges were starting to break up after about 30 seconds. When he landed, his papers were taken away and he was told not to talk about what he had seen to anyone else. When he looked at his logbook again, it would be weeks after the war was over and it would be on a table in front of him in an interrogation room. Later, the document was sent to the Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama, where researchers later found it. In 1973, the main coastal town of Owl's Head is about 5 miles from the city of Rockland. It gets its name from the peninsula on which it is located. Owl's Head is a popular vacation spot, and its 19th-century granite lighthouse is probably its most well-known landmark. But in the fall of 1940, a mysterious and deeply troubling event took place in this beautiful resort. Monday, September 18th, around noon, an older couple walking along a nearby coastal trail saw a single plane coming from the direction of Vinyl Haven, Ireland, toward the town. This wasn't strange by itself, because the PBM Mariner patrols regularly off the coast of Maine to look for German U-boats. But as time went on, it became clear that this plane did not belong to the US Navy. Both witnesses said that the plane had 6 engines instead of the Mariner's 2, and that the fuselage was much thinner and longer. It was also painted in a dark camouflage pattern, which was very different from the bright colors of US planes. Naval patrol craft. As they watched, they could see that the strange plane was steadily losing altitude as it came in from the other side of the ocean and got closer and closer to the clear water below. The plane kept falling slowly and painfully for a few more minutes, until the inevitable happened. A blade from one of the propellers hit the water's surface, sending the plane cartwheeling into nothingness in a matter of seconds. There was nothing left but churning water and smoke rising from where the plane had crashed into the bay. After waiting a short time to see if anyone was still alive, the couple hurried back to town and told the Knox County Sheriff's Department what had happened. The military was then asked about what was going on, and they said they didn't know of any planned activities in the area and that all of their planes were safe. The deputies sent to look into the report found nothing but a small oil slick when they used one of the local fishermen's boats to search. So, there was no further investigation. On the morning of September 28th, 10 days later, the bodies of 3 dead men were found in Penobscot Bay, just north of the town. As the person who found the bodies waited for the police to arrive, he saw that they were wearing grayish-blue overalls and had things on them that made him think they were pilots. Yellow and brown tabs on the collar of one of the men seemed to show some kind of rank. Even though the resident didn't recognize this symbol, the black medal in the shape of a cross on the left breast pocket made him feel uneasy. He realized that whatever they were looking at was out of their area of responsibility. The deputies who were there immediately told the military what was going on. They stayed at the scene and helped keep back the growing crowd of onlookers while soldiers found the bodies of the 3 pilots and took them to the nearby Ash Point Naval Air Station. But this wasn't the last time the locals heard about it. Over the next few days, military and government officials kept coming to the town. Some of these people said they were Army intelligence officers, while others said they were FBI agents. They asked if anyone else had seen what had happened, and no matter what the answer was, they all made sure to stress that the bodies came from a submarine that had sunk farther out in the bay and that there had been no plane crash after the war. The story of the 3 German airmen who died stayed very clear in people's minds. Years later, a local diver named Reuben Whitmore decided to learn more about what happened. He dove in and around the area for a few months to look for signs of the crash. Even though the supposed wreck wasn't there, he was able to find a few small pieces of metal right where the plane had supposedly crashed. Experts later figured out that one of these metal pieces was a manufacturer's plate. Even though it had rusted and worn down while it was under the water, the letters on it were still clear. This was made up of a serial number and the word Oberstkommando, which is a German military term for pilot with the rank of colonel. The fact that the downed plane's wreckage seems to have been found in secret and that the US military says it never existed raises some troubling questions. During the Second World War, the American military did not try to deny or hide similar attacks by Japanese planes launched from submarines. So what was it that made them want to hide this particular enemy attack? No one knows what this German bomber on loan is used for. If this kind of plane had been armed with normal weapons, it wouldn't have been able to do much damage to anything on the American mainland. Given the dangers of the long range it would need to operate at and the strong defenses of the US Air Force, it would not be a good idea. This would be the same as trying to kill yourself. So why did these young German airmen die so far away from their home country? The answer lies in a secret German military project called America Bomber that began in 1938, before World War II. Adolf Hitler knew that his plans to take over Europe in the future could bring the United States and the Third Reich into direct conflict. He told the Luftwaffe to start looking for a bomber that could drop its load in New York City and still have enough fuel to fly back home. At the time this request was made, there were no planes on Earth that could make the 7,200-mile round trip, let alone one full of explosives. Like a lot of Hitler's orders. The project got the lip service it needed, and then it was put away out of sight. But this would change right away when the United States joined the war in December 1941. The Luftwaffe had a new top priority all of a sudden. There were a lot of different ideas, like planes with jet engines or modified rocket technology. But the truth was that the Germans didn't have the money or skills to do something like that. Instead, a lot of work went into making the J, a conventional bomber that was specially adapted to do the job. U-390. As was the case with many German military projects, the finished planes came too late to change the course of the war, and the lack of basic resources meant that not many were ever made. In the last days of World War II, the Allies thought that there was only one working prototype of the plane, which was found to be broken apart when the American Army took over the island in November 1940. But that changed when a Luftwaffe pilot named Unteroffizier Wolf Baumgart was questioned after the war. Baumgart, who was an expert in photographic reconnaissance, said that 7 Ju-390s had been built, and that they had flown as far as Cape Town and Tokyo. But it was made illegal. Guards said that one of these planes had made it all the way to New York. That made his captors feel the worst. In January 1940, The Luftwaffe officer said this for a J. The U-390 took off from the airfield at Mont-de-Marsan, which is close to Bordeaux. Over the next 32 hours, it flew across the Atlantic Ocean and got as close as 12 miles to New York City, where it took several pictures of its famous skyline. In 2007, an online story that backed up the first one said that another U-390 had made it to Ohio in early 1944. After taking off from an airport in Norway, this plane was said to have been able to take pictures of the coast off Long Island on its way back. These stories, plus the fact that the U-390 did have 6 engines, which seems to add a lot of weight to the idea that one of them may have crashed in Maine. The year was 1940. As soon as the United States joined the war, Hitler became obsessed with getting some kind of symbolic victory over his new enemy. He was furious that so many Germans had died because of the constant bombing by the Allies, and he vowed to find a way to get even. The only way to get the same result was to drop a nuclear bomb on a big American city. History tells us that no matter how hard Germany tried, they were not able to make a real nuclear weapon during the war. But the supposed nuclear explosion that Hans Zinser saw while flying near the Ludwigs's testing grounds directly contradicts this story. Obviously, his story would be easy to dismiss if there wasn't a witness who wrote about it after the war was over to back it up. An Italian war reporter named Luisa Mira said that in October 1944, the same month as the census report, he was sent to Germany at the request of Benito Mussolini. While there, he was taken to a remote island in the Baltic Sea, not far from the coast, where he saw a huge and blinding explosion. When he asked his military guards what had caused the explosion, they told him it was a fission weapon. The whole point of the America Bomber project was to drop a superweapon right in the middle of enemy territory. This superweapon was meant to kill as many people as possible and give the Nazi leadership a propaganda victory that the world had never seen before. If Hitler had been able to get such a device, he could have had a lot of power in negotiations and maybe even changed. If the enemies had stopped their attacks out of fear of more explosions, the war might have ended differently. On the other hand, they might have been forced to drop atomic bombs on Germany instead of Japan. After the successful Normandy landings, the window of opportunity for such an attack on the American mainland would have been closing quickly. If the Germans had been able to make a fission weapon that worked, they would have had few resources to use. They probably wouldn't have been able to make more than one of these. What happened to make the US military to deny that a German plane crashed off the coast of Maine and then recover the plane's remains in secret? What did the first Navy divers who went to the wreckage find? They were looking for a bomb bay full of weapons, but instead they found a strange-looking single weapon. What really is? We will never know the truth about the Owl's Head crash, unless the US government tells us in the future. This may have been another test flight or reconnaissance mission for the people who made the U-390, or maybe a last-ditch effort to give the German people some good news or a propaganda coup. The conventional bombing raid on an American city was a symbolic response to the bombings that destroyed Germany's infrastructure from the air. But it's still possible that this was something much worse, something that was so bad and scary to American leaders that it had to be kept from the American people. And if this was true, we should be glad it didn't happen.